Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's communique just in from Invasion Headquarters summarizes the news of all the successful landings. Allied forces, it says, have succeeded in their initial landings in France, and fighting continues. The communique goes on with air action, saying that all day Allied planes continued their bombing in what the dispatch calls very great strength. Another bulletin states that a German counterattack is in the making. It says the first German counterattack is likely to materialize within the next 48 hours. And another bulletin just in emphasizes the element of surprise, saying that the Nazis were caught off their guard in an effective surprise by the Allied forces. Well, the news pictures Allied troops battling in the streets of the Norman city of Caen. That place is 9.5 miles inland, which represents a drive of that far from the beachheads established early this morning. The Germans tell us that the landing forces are broadening and strengthening their positions and getting incessant reinforcements. New masses of troops, new tons of armament pouring ashore. Caen is at the base of the Norman Peninsula, which thrusts northward into the English Channel, and the drive to the town makes it look as if the strategy were to cut across the base of that peninsula and force a Nazi withdrawal from the whole area. The possession of that peninsula would mean a powerful base from which Allied thrusts could be driven inland, probably in the direction of Paris. To the British troops in the Second Front forces, that town of Caen represents historic memories. That is, if they have time to think about it. For it was there in the river that William the Conqueror in 1066 assembled his fleet with which he invaded Britain, the Norman conquest, and the mortal remains of the conqueror lie interned in the church of Saint-Etienne in the city of Caen. The latest advices from both sides, allied and enemy, picture the invasion as concentrated at 3 points: the mouth of the Orne River, where Caen lies, and 40 miles westward along the coast, the mouth of the Vire River. That point, too, threatens the base of the peninsula, and the Germans report that the Allied troops have cut an important highway still further along. Nazi accounts tell us that there have been landings also in the area between Boulogne and Calais, the Dover Straits, across the narrowest width of water from Britain. The German radio is quoted as saying that Allied airborne troops have seized a flying field in that sector, although there is no Allied confirmation of this so far. It so happens that the coastal battlefield is one of the most familiar stretches of ground on this earth. The French Channel shore from Cherbourg to Le Havre, for many years one of the commonest routes of travel for American tourists visiting Europe. They often landed at Cherbourg, and then the railroad to Paris took them along the coastal lands. I myself have made that railroad trip many a time and have seen the coast from the water side. Flat country, only slight rises of ground from the beaches. Cherbourg itself on a tall, rugged headland, a strongly fortified harbor just below. And around Calais and Dieppe, there are cliffs, like those white cliffs of Dover right across the channel. But in between the Calais-Dieppe area and Cherbourg, the beaches are broad and flat, and the level ground extends on inward, a water-level route to Paris. And so, any of the thousands of travelers who have made the railroad trip will appreciate the statement in the invasion news coming in that the most favorable stretch of coast was selected for the Second Front landings today. The events of today were studded with records, too. The greatest fleet of ships ever to set sail. 4,000 ships and thousands of lesser craft. The greatest army ever to strike at a hostile shore. That vast force of men and machines, tens of thousands of men increasing to hundreds of thousands, millions before it is over. And the greatest air assault ever delivered. Before the day began, in the hours of darkness between midnight and dawn, thousands of British planes hurled more than 5,000 tons of bombs on the Nazi fortifications. Then more than 1,000 American heavy bombers took up the assault, and soon the total tonnage of bombs was more than 11,000. A British air officer remarks that the total tonnage of bombs dropped in this one day of invasion was greater than the amount that the Germans hurled on Britain during the entire 6 months of the Great Blitz. The most colorful news of the day concerns the paratroopers, those airborne forces which struck behind the Nazi Atlantic walls in advance of the landing of the seaborne soldiers. A United Press correspondent who witnessed invasion scenes from the coast of England describes the sky as looking like what he calls a Christmas tree with colored lights strung out in long lines. These, he goes on, were the running lights of the planes carrying airborne troops. The lights were to identify them to anti-aircraft batteries in Britain. Wave after wave of these airborne fleets, he relates, passed over the coast in a steady stream, their colored lights beaming and finally vanishing as they disappeared over the channel in the direction of France. In that first wave of paratroopers was an outfit which reminds you of American history of times gone by. Indians, yes, Indians, wearing their tribal scalp locks. They restrained their tribal war whoop, however, while descending silently, parachuting to earth. Then all of their ancestral stealth was needed when they got down, as they spread out over the country today. Their job needed the stealth of the braves of times gone by. For these Indians landing in France today were Yaqui and Cherokee tribesmen. They were demolition engineers whose task it was to sneak in and blow up enemy installations. One of the paratroopers to jump today was Robert Hillman of Hartford, Connecticut, who felt an especial sense of security. This story, by the way, is wired me by an old friend, Ted Shane of the Black Watch, author of a book called Heroes of the Pacific. Shane tells how recently Private Hillman said to a colonel at inspection, "I know my chute is okay because my mother checked it. She works in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final ones over to all the chutes." Prime Minister Winston Churchill's formal report on D-Day was given in tones of measured optimism in two statements to the House of Commons, the second of which recited the progress of events up to mid-afternoon. Sober and factual tones made his disclosures all the more encouraging. "This operation," said Winston Churchill to the Commons, "is proceeding in a highly satisfactory manner." And then he went on, "Many dangers and difficulties which last night seemed to be extremely formidable are behind us. Passage of the sea," he exclaimed, "has been made with far less loss than we apprehended." And he went on to say that the bristling batteries of Nazi guns across the Channel had been greatly weakened by air bombing and the fire of naval artillery. And Churchill emphasized in these words, "Landings and follow-ups are proceeding with very much less loss than we expected." However, Churchill went on with his usual note of realistic caution. "All this," he said, "although a very favorable and vitally essential first step, cannot indicate what may be the course of battle in the next few weeks, because the enemy will endeavor to concentrate in this area. And in that event, heavy fighting," said Churchill, "will soon begin and will continue without any end so long as the enemy can push troops in. This is, however," he concluded, "the most serious time, and we enter upon it with our great allies, all in good heart and good friendship." President Roosevelt this afternoon added his own warning against overconfidence. He pointed out that it is one thing to land successfully on enemy beaches and another to drive the long, hard miles to the heart of the enemy country. The President said that the decision to launch today's blow was made last December at the Churchill-Stalin-Roosevelt Conference in Tehran. It was then decided that the Second Front would get underway toward the end of May or the first days of June. No exact date could be fixed because that depended on accidents of weather. The President added that he himself had known the exact date, Tuesday, June 6, 1944, only during these past few days. So he knew it last night when he was on the radio. The President says that while he was on the air making his broadcast concerning the fall of Rome, he was aware that the invasion boats already were on their way across the English Channel. One of the tense turns of drama was enacted today in a motor trailer under a tent somewhere along the southern coast of England. The trailer, headquarters of General Ike Eisenhower. From this, he will direct the onslaught until the Allied command crosses the Channel and sets up headquarters on French soil. So early this morning, there was the ruddy-faced and ordinarily smiling Eisenhower. But he was tense now, in a moment of his great decision. It was for him to give the order for the hurling of the Second Front. Was this the time? Should he set the whole vast offensive into operation? That was a question of whether. It had been noticed that during the past 48 hours, the usual Eisenhower posture had been head cocked up, looking at the sky. D-Day had been scheduled for yesterday, but no, it did not take one of those Eisenhower looks at the sky to see that the weather was bad, stormy, bad for flying, impossible for paratroop operations, channel too rough for the efficient handling of boats. The general's glances upward were a quest for signs of clearing, harbingers of better weather. So what were the prospects for today? Eisenhower and the top-ranking commanders studied the weather reports, the weatherman being the real commander-in-chief for the declaration of D-Day. The meteorological reports turned out to be good enough, but the weather today was by no means perfect. Not too good for bombing fleets of the sky, though these did a huge and devastating task. The channel was quieter than yesterday, though still choppy. That turbulent strait, whose seasickness-producing antics are a legend. For the airborne assault, the question of weather was the most critical of all. Things have got to be just right for dropping paratroopers in the dim break between darkness and dawn. Well, all of these chances were a weighty burden on the mind of the commanding general who had to decide, go ahead or delay again. Eisenhower has ample heart and courage for making a decision, and he gave the fateful order, D-Day. Surely he had enough to occupy the mind of any one man, enough to monopolize every thought in his head. And yet I wonder whether his fancy did not stray, at least for a brief moment, to this side of the ocean. I wonder, did he stop and think for a moment of that tall bluff on the broad river, with the height crowned by stately buildings? Did he think of West Point and his wife and his son? For it's a moody coincidence that this invasion day, which Eisenhower marked down in history, was also graduation day at West Point, and his son John was one of the graduating class. His mother was there to see him get his diploma, while his father was over there, commanding on D-Day. In Soviet Russia, the invasion news was announced with all the military fanfare that attends the proclamation of a great Red Army victory. And today's Moscow Dispatch tells us that the Russian people exploded with an outburst of joy greater than they usually accord their own triumphs. Everywhere in Moscow, the hope was expressed that the war would end quickly now, and the Red Army seems about to do its own large bit toward that happy consummation. The word is tonight that the Russians will launch another big offensive of their own within 24 or 48 hours, almost certainly before the end of this week. The second front to be supported by a new big push on the first front. As for the war news from Italy, of course it's eclipsed by the much greater events along the English Channel. We may note, however, that yesterday's action still continues, the Fifth Army driving rapidly forward, with the Germans in full retreat. For a brief while, the battlefront was along the historic river Tiber, from Rome to the sea. But with only the briefest pause, British and American troops were across the Tiber, which for all its venerable reputation is no great stream, according to American standards. From the river, the advance pushed on along a 17-mile front, and so much for Italy. Well, the nation here at home today took the D-Day news with a feeling of earnestness and hope. Everywhere people were soberly repeating the exclamation of a sergeant as his boat pushed off in that dim light this morning. They can't stop us, so said the sergeant. Many an amusement feature was shut down today because of the feeling that it wasn't appropriate to the news that was flashing in. Typical was a Marine Corps sergeant at Hollywood in the early hours of the morning. He had just won a jitterbugging contest in a nightclub, and he was beaming. And then he heard the news, and he said sheepishly, I feel sort of silly. One of the oddities is the fact that at Reno, that wide-open Nevada town, the gambling houses closed down today. Across the land, there were demonstrations of patriotism. At Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell rang, that symbol of American freedom. And in numberless churches, the bells pealed out, calling people to prayer. Over in England, the appeal to divine providence was led by the king, whose prayer concluded with the solemn cadence, We shall not ask that God may do our will, said the king, but that we may be enabled to do the will of God. And in this country, the president leads the nation in prayer tonight in the countrywide broadcast. Meanwhile, let's switch to Washington now to hear a voice that can speak an appeal with singular appropriateness. Chaplain Brigadier General William R. Arnold, Chief of the Chaplains of the United States Army.
Almighty and eternal God, and we, thy humble servants, are on our knees this fateful day to adore thee and to implore thy help. Thou who knowest the weakness and the frailty of our nature, hast shown us through the sufferings and sacrifice of thy beloved Son how to be brave and strong and victorious. As our fathers, sons, and brothers on distant battlefields fight valiantly for our liberties and for thy truth and justice, graciously shed the light of thy countenance upon them and sustain them by the power of thine unconquerable will. Send angels of thy heavenly host to lead them on to a glorious victory for thy honor and glory. Amen.
And on that solemn note, we conclude one of the greatest days in the history of man, a day meant to mark the turning point of the global war. In years to come, the world and its history will tell again and again of this day, June 6th, D-Day, Invasion Day. And so long until tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. This is the National Broadcasting Company. WEAF, New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, again NBC interrupts its schedule for a brief pause, inviting its listeners to devote a very special prayer to our fighting forces. Dr. Ralph W. Sockman, pastor of Christ Church in New York and officiating minister on NBC's national radio pulpit, will lead us in offering this meditation. Dr. Sockman.
Our Father, in whose will is our peace and in whose love is our hope, we turn to Thee in trust and confidence. Bridge with our prayers these oceans which separate us from our loved ones, that they may feel us beside them in spirit. Fly with those who flash through the darkened sky. Journey with those who sail the seas. Protect them in body and in spirit. Give strength, O God, to those who struggle, wisdom to those who lead, skill to those who heal, and comfort to those who mourn, and grant us all courage for whatever may come, and patience to wait and work for Thy will to achieve its victory through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Sockman.
Good evening. This is Robert St. John speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York and bringing you the news of the world. Tonight, our News of the World program has been expanded to a full half hour without commercial announcements. A little later, we will bring you our own reporters speaking directly from 4 United Nations capitals, London, Moscow, Washington, and liberated Rome. But first, here is a quick 5-minute roundup of the invasion situation up to 7 p.m. Eastern War Time. On the beachheads of France, the first full day of battle is now over. And how has that battle gone? Well, we have the word of the men who are running the operation thus far that things have gone better than they had expected. Let me quote them briefly. Supreme Headquarters says, initial landings succeed, fighting proceeds. Winston Churchill says that the enemy was surprised by our landings. The airborne troops are well established behind Nazi lines. The Allied forces have penetrated several miles inland. Losses have been far lighter than had been anticipated, and the operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. President Roosevelt says the invasion of Europe is up to schedule. Air losses were light, only about 1%. Naval losses to mid-afternoon were only 2 destroyers and 1 escort vessel. Secretary of War Stimson, the invasion is going very nicely. General Monty Montgomery, the actual combat commander, says that he is pleased with the initial phase of the operation. Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the Fleet, puts it this way. The invasion is doing all right so far. The most encouraging word of all is that casualties, Allied casualties, have not been nearly as great as had been expected. Of course, our men still have to face the first counterattack of the enemy. The Nazis have fallen back. They're waiting to see whether this is the real thing or whether this is just one of many strikes at Europe. And the Luftwaffe is also waiting. Once Hermann Goering declared, invasion must be beaten off even if the Luftwaffe perishes. But today the Luftwaffe remains in hiding. One report says only 50 German planes were encountered. Our side put 11,000 fighters and bombers into the air. Perhaps Hitler and his field marshals are worried about additional surprises, which Winston Churchill told the world today the Nazis could expect. Hitler now has 2 active fronts, something he never wanted. One front in Italy, another front in France. And there are indications tonight, if you read between the lines, that a 3rd front is about to burst into violence. I wouldn't be surprised if, before the night is over, the Russian army opened its great offensive. Large-scale air battles are taking place right now between Red Army planes and the Luftwaffe over Romania. And we've just had a bulletin that U.S. bombers based in Russia have joined in attacking German targets in Romania. Churchill has hinted there may be a 4th and a 5th front, that the Allies may make landings in other parts of the coast. But the objective of today's big operation is the seizure of the entire Normandy Peninsula. that finger of land which sticks out into the channel and comes just 90 miles from touching Britain. That is our first objective, but the real goal is Paris. Paris, which lies much less than 200 miles from where Allied soldiers are tonight dug in. And now we take you to the Invasion Center, to NBC in London. London apparently isn't ready for us yet, so let me go on just a little bit longer. Here are a few odd little sidelights on the main story, which I've been collecting for you today. The invasion was postponed 24 hours because of weather. As the first Americans went ashore, the low-lying clouds were painted with dabs of purple. Hundreds of the doughboys were inspired as they rowed across the channel by the sight of a resplendent rainbow which streaked the sky over France, with the pot of gold, the end of the rainbow, on the horizon in the direction of Paris. London tells us that the Allied Army of Liberation carried many a secret weapon into battle. Adolf Hitler right now is reported to be rushing across Europe toward the actual battlefront. And now to London.
Come in, London.
From the air today has been the almost universal expression of surprise at the relative feebleness of German resistance. There have been casualties, of course. Inevitably, in such an enterprise, ships are sunk, planes go whirling down in flames. Men are wounded and men die. But has been the occasional curious and pleasant experience in the Pacific in the war against the Japs. At almost every point when our great mailed fist is struck today, the Germans' European fortress has been relatively ill protected. One must repeat that word, relatively. A feeble striking force would have found the Nazis strong at every beach. Our enormous force, however, clearly has not yet encountered either the quantity, the quality, or the rigidity of the resistance it expected. The first vessels to move against the French coast were the minesweepers. The moon, of course, is full. At no hour of the night was visibility poor. Yet those vessels and the tensely, largely British crews who manned them moved ahead upon their dangerous errand almost unchallenged. They advanced across the luminous and choppy sea until their bottoms nearly scraped upon the foreshore of the European continent. The landing craft went through the paths that had been made for them with astonishingly light losses. That fact, of such primary importance, a source of such tremendous relief, was confirmed late today from a top official source by NBC's own staff correspondent, Merrill Muller, who was attached during the opening phase of the invasion to Supreme Allied Headquarters, somewhere in England. Muller reported that the Naval Command actually responsible for delivering the American, British, and Canadian armies at high tide mark had made the comparatively optimistic estimate that at least 10% of the landing craft would be lost in the first wave. Actual losses were far below that figure. The steel and concrete snags that were presumed to have been erected in great numbers just below the sea's surface on all the possible approaches to Europe were conspicuous by their, again, relative scarcity. What we know least about so far is the actual progress of the fight ashore. But there, too, the impression is the German response has been not less bitter, but apparently less powerful than many had imagined that it would be. There is no question whatever that enemy air action has been just plain feeble. One would certainly think that if the enemy still has a Luftwaffe, he would use it now. But, and I stress, thus far, he has not done so. Air resistance over nearby Europe has been negligible. An air officer has just assured me that impatient Allied fighter pilots have gone hunting for Nazi planes to shoot down and have come home sorely disappointed. As with everyone else within range, I so deeply appreciated during the opening offensives in Italy. Nazi artillery today in France has been unimpressive. And by no means least of all, the people of London and southeast England, the long-threatened German super-rocket guns that were allegedly capable of tossing giant explosive loads all the way to Piccadilly have not yet gone into action, though tapping wood is still in order. There are several explanations. One, the easiest and the pleasantest, is that our superlative weapon of air power has kept the promise of the enthusiasts, and down through the months and years has induced a fatal weakness in the Reich. Unquestionably, that is part of the explanation. Ed Hawker of NBC, who flew this morning through a sky peppered with German anti-aircraft fire over the Cherbourg Peninsula, brought back the estimate that as perhaps as many as 7,000 Allied planes were in the air today against the enemy. Today, specifically, most of their crashing attention was given to the comparatively narrow battle area. When such firepower as that is directed at hostile forces and positions, artillery emplacements are mangled and buried in thrown earth. Carefully placed big guns are twisted from their strong foundations. Enemy traffic is disrupted and turned back. Men cringe and quail and quit and die. The latest communique issued here just a little over an hour ago heavily underlined that interpretation of events. A high Allied officer also notes that never before in history have so many actual combat infantrymen been carried by plane with such success direct into a field of action. It would, though, probably be just as well to remember that that may not be the whole explanation. It is far too soon, certainly, to throw one's hat in the air. Lift it by all means. Lift it to gallant men and skilled commanders. But for a long time, the Nazis have conceded that it would be possible, if enough force were used, for us to make good on initial landings on the European coast. Since Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Nazi invasion coast's supreme commander, could not guess precisely where we were going to land, the German defense plan has always been to keep large, flexible reserves at points in the interior. The real test of arms, therefore, will come when the Nazi generals, and one can hope that the rumor is true that Adolf Hitler himself is in the West fumbling the battle with his own peculiar incompetence, when the Nazi generals make up their minds where our main attack is being launched, and then launch their own massive counterattack, which will be designed to drive us back into the sea. That, remember, was what they tried to do at Anzio, and that was what they so signally failed to do in a vastly better natural position against an infinitely weaker Allied force. We have learned much from that earlier experience. We have learned much in the time that has passed since then. We have grown stronger, while inevitably under the rain of bombs and fire that have been spread by day and night like a cosmic plague across the German land, and under the wounding assaults from south and east, the enemy must surely have grown weaker. It is announced here today that the Allies have used many new secret weapons. There has been no news from any source of the revelation of any Nazi secret tricks, as yet. Since the supreme headquarters of the Allied force, locally called SHAEF, is still reserved in its claims, the chief reliance thus far has been upon individual observers. The National Broadcasting Company has distinguished representation among them. David Anderson, who flew over France today with a unit of the Tactical Air Force, is the authority for the belief that the Germans were, as they say, tactically surprised. His was the first report of the astounding repainting job done just before HR, when all the troop carriers bound south and east were boldly repainted in wide black and white stripes, so as to avoid any possible confusion and to prevent any losses from our own guns. That, by the way, is almost arrogant proof of our air position, for all thought of plain camouflage has been utterly discarded. Wright Bryan of the NBC staff spent the first hour of the invasion flying at only a few hundred feet over the soil of France, watching our faultlessly trained American paratroopers go spinning out of the great transports under their blossoming mushroom sails in perfect formation to land in the pre-dawn dusk below. And now, if you'll forgive me for just a moment, I seem to have a page of my script missing. You can understand that this is a thoroughly addled situation here for the moment. In the dust below, to undertake the brave task of giving instant battle to the enemy's rear, Stanley Richardson, NBC's London bureau chief, was assigned to the naval forces and broadcast long before most Americans were out of bed the superb good tidings that all beachheads had been made on schedule. That, by no means small matter, the landings were made in the right places, and the ship losses were astonishingly light. William Chaplin and I and the General Scurry have, during these long, sleepless and foodless hours, for the time being inherited the colorless, though supposedly necessary task of inuring ourselves in an immensely crowded London basement, close to the microphones, and close to the close-mouthed purveyors of the Allied dispatches and the Allied news. And I can assure you we are both growing restless and rebellious. A late report from the Channel front does concede that as the sun declined, a few German fighters did appear southeast of the Cherbourg Peninsula battle area. But our men have been looking for the chance. There is so far no reason to think that belated Nazi effort in the air was crowned with any great success, or that it in any material way has affected the tide of the hard fighting that is at this very instant going on not much more than 100 miles from here. The setting of the sun has brought another cancellation, or at least postponement, of another threat that had long been looked for. With fingers crossed, I take pleasure in announcing that up to this late hour there has been no air alert in London. With the approach of darkness, the Channel seems to have done the expected and roughened. There may therefore be a heavier call for our oft-reported new secret weapon, the magic cure we suppose to have against seasickness. There is, however, no reason to suspect that nature, thus far so singularly friendly to us on all fronts, is giving any important aid or comfort to the enemy. The late-night communique, remember, it's after 1 o'clock in the morning, London time, for the first time gives the exact hour when the actual invasion began. Allied night bombers opened the assault at a few minutes before midnight, just a little more than 13 hours ago. A 13 that has, at this speaking, been markedly unlucky for the German enemy. Gliders, now deemed to be well past their experimental stage as actual vehicles of combat, have had heavy employment. As you know, of course, the lesson learned at Kwajalein Atoll has been put to use here in a colder and more narrow sea. The huge guns of battleships and lighter but hardly less deadly warships of other categories prepared the way ahead by heavy shelling of the landing area. I return you now, this is John W. Vandercook in London. I return you now to Robert St. John in New York.
This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom. Before I give you a few bulletins, let me read you an announcement. At 7:30 p.m. Eastern War Time, over most of these stations, you will hear an NBC exclusive program of historic importance, a poem and prayer for an invading army, written especially for D-Day by Edna St. Vincent Millay and starring the distinguished actor, Mr. Ronald Colman. And now here are some bulletins which have just come in while you have been listening to John W. Vandercook. London hears from Stockholm that Adolf Hitler is expected to make a speech very soon from somewhere in the West as personal commander of anti-invasion operations. And here's another bulletin from London which says that Berlin Radio tonight declares that about 15 Allied cruisers and 50 or 60 Allied destroyers are standing by in the English Channel just off Le Havre, apparently awaiting orders to hit the coast. And the German DNB news agency reports tonight that Marshal Karl von Rundstedt and Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Nazi commanders in Western Europe, are now on the spot of developments. I suppose that means they're at the front. We have a story from London tonight about Nazi propaganda. Here is what the Nazi line has been today. Today, Nazi propaganda harped on the theme that the Germans are glad the final test has come in the West, and that they're confident of the outcome. Nazi radio commentators and Dr. Paul Goebbels himself acknowledged that this attack is no mere sham, and that the real test in France has finally come. The German propaganda minister spoke at a National Socialist Party meeting in a town which was very recently very heavily raided by Allied flyers. And he blustered this way. The enemy believes the situation in Germany to be the same as in 1918, but the enemy is mistaken. The ears of the Germans are shut against enemy propaganda and enemy slogans. The nerve campaign recently launched by the enemy in connection with the question of the invasion likewise failed to impress the German people. We are ready to receive the enemy. A speaker for Transocean News, a Nazi propaganda agency, reported that life remains quite normal in Berlin and that there's no excitement, no extra editions of the newspapers, no special radio announcements. Well, if you were up during the night and listened to us between 12:30 and 3:30 a.m. today, you know how untrue that is. You know about all the special bulletins which we put on the air from here, from Berlin, bulletins about the invasion. Dr. Goebbels unleashed today a long-prepared assortment of anti-invasion propaganda on the French. Its theme was, "Don't help the Allies, you will be sorry when your country is handed over to the Bolsheviks by the Allies. For German consumption, Goebbels said the German nation is listening to one single command, and this is the great Führer's command. Under his command, we have overcome even the most serious crisis. And now we take you to Honolulu.
This is Robert McCormick in Honolulu. For the first time since I've been in the Central Pacific, Honolulu today has forgotten about the Japanese War. The preoccupation with the Pacific fighting has been so intense out here that I never supposed anything could distract the good people of the Hawaiian Islands. But the invasion of France has done the trick. Last night, the lights of Honolulu blazed away until dawn as Honolulu listened to NBC's magnificent coverage of the European invasion. The city was more brilliantly lighted than at any time since Pearl Harbor. Defense workers who have to get up at 5 in the morning to get to their jobs by 7 didn't even bother to go to bed. Yet those I saw going to work this morning seemed too excited to be tired. The pushing and shoving in the buses was no less vigorous than it is on a normal day. Then we have a message from Lieutenant General Richardson here to the Supreme Allied Command of the European Theater of Operations. General Richardson said, "Every soldier in the Central Pacific area is watching with pride and admiration the magnificent achievements of the forces under your command. We send you our prayers and our best wishes for every continuing success." The excitement here is understandable. We've a distinct feeling here that the success of the invasion will determine to a large extent the length and costliness of the Pacific War. The invasion of Europe is the last phase of the European War. That much seems obvious. We've moved rapidly in the Pacific since the first of the year. Much more rapidly than we thought possible even 1 year ago. But it's highly unlikely that we're yet ready for our final big push. Our invasion of the Japanese mainland seems a long way off right at this point. But the speed with which our troops clean up the Germans may speed up the critical day out here. One thing is certain, however, the war here won't wait. As I've said before, we probably will have invasions of our own out in the Pacific even before a decision is reached in Europe. They may be invasions on almost as big a scale as the mammoth affair going on now in Europe. So long as the Central Pacific War is a naval war, it can go right ahead. It can take us up to the coast of China, right up to the threshold of the Japanese mainland. And if that war in Europe ends quickly, it means, for one thing, that while England is already helping us beat the Japs, when the Germans are cleaned up, we'll find out whether we'll also get help over here from our other great ally, the Soviet Union. This is Robert McCormick in Honolulu, switching you to NBC in Washington.
This is Morgan Beatty in our nation's capital. Now it can be told. The approximate date for the second front, the front that Joseph Stalin had wanted, was set in Tehran last December. President Roosevelt told us newsmen today as much of the story behind the story of invasion as he could. The second front was to come in late May or early June, in the very first days of June at the latest. The weather played the most important role in setting D-Day. The English Channel, you know, is rough, too rough for landing craft until late in May. Mr. Roosevelt said the design of invasion satisfied Marshal Stalin completely. Reporters began tossing this point back at the chief executive. There in his crowded White House office this afternoon, trying, as we reporters always will, to get all the answers you people want on the receiving end of the news. Mr. Roosevelt good-naturedly said our questions were becoming improper, and we knew it, but he was all smiles and no hard feelings. What pleased him most was the fact that the Allies had gained bridgeheads with the loss of only 2 destroyers and 1 landing ship tank. Our air losses were less than 1%, and he didn't say what the beachhead losses were. The losses among the combat teams, that is, that first set foot on enemy shores. But clearly, those losses were not nearly as great as the High Command had expected or counted on. Mr. Roosevelt sat up most of last night, you know, and so he was tired today, at least sleeping. But he's sticking on to 10 o'clock tonight, Eastern Wartime, to lead the nation in prayer. The prayer he's been writing for several days. The text was released in advance so that you may join him in the service if you wish. The prayer is highlighted by a request for divine aid in the struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization and to set free a suffering humanity. The President told us in that Oval Office on the ground floor of the White House today that our great danger now is overconfidence. Overconfidence can, in his opinion, impede the war effort and impede war production. The war is not over, he said. This operation isn't over. Incidentally, Admiral Ernest King of the Navy had expressed the same thought earlier today at the White House in another interview, when he said that invasion was going all right so far. The Germans, obviously, as you've been given word already, are not ready to commit their service or their reserves of either air power or manpower as yet. They sacrificed bridgeheads to us to gain knowledge of our plans as they unfold. But neither is there any cause for lack of confidence in events to date. Confidence fairly radiated from every point in Washington where D-Day was planned and in part executed. But now, for a turn around the Washington scene, here is Richard Harkness to give you the feel of the Capitol on D-Day.
Well, the President's attitude of calm, almost serene confidence is characteristic of the rest of Washington this D-Day evening. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, for instance, took time out only long enough to tell us newsmen that the invasion is going nicely, and then he went back to work. Well, General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of our invading army, did not show up at his office in the Pentagon building until 7:30 o'clock this morning. General Marshall explained reasonably that he had done his work before the invasion. Well, Mrs. Roosevelt confessed that she, too, had known the invasion date in advance. And she says this is a day which has been hanging like a sword over our heads, but in itself it isn't very important. Well, the diplomatic representatives here from our United Nations share our leaders' confidence of success. Lord Halifax, the tall, gaunt ambassador from Great Britain, says we all have complete confidence in General Eisenhower, in his deputy commanders, and complete confidence in our allied troops. The Russian ambassador, short, stocky Andrei Gromyko, adds this: what Hitler and his criminal clique have dreaded most has happened. Germany is now forced to carry on the war on two fronts. Well, Congress went about its business almost as usual this D-Day. The Senate and House began their sessions with a moment of silent prayer. The House Committee heard Sewell Avery, the chairman of Montgomery Ward, attack the National Labor Relations Board and the War Labor Board for seizing his plant in Chicago. Then the House, harking back to Pearl Harbor, wants Admiral Kimmel and General Short brought up for court-martial within the next 3 months. Now, there are some officials here this invasion day still worried about the strike outlook. This D-Day finds some 14,000 workers still idle. The most important strike, perhaps, is the walkout in the Wright Aeronautical Plant at Lockland, Ohio. Well, that is the picture of Washington on this June 6th D-Day. Our war leaders calm and confident. The people in the Capitol unexcited. The Capitol spirit best described by President Roosevelt's decision to lead the nation in prayer by radio at 10 o'clock this evening. I return you now to Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York.
The wildest invasion celebrations in all the world today were probably those which took part in far-off China, removed by so many thousands of miles from the scene of the operations. The Chinese celebrated so enthusiastically because they figure that this means that the war in Europe will soon be over, and then British-American forces can turn to the east and help finish off the Japanese. The people in Tokyo got news of the invasion from their own radio, but only the Berlin version of what was happening. In Russia, there were many happy, excited celebrations. And here's a bulletin. Supreme Headquarters says that well over 1,000 troop-carrying planes took part in the airborne phase of the invasion, and that the battleship Nevada is in action in the Channel, along with the cruisers Augusta and Tuscaloosa. I am sorry that we weren't able to get Rome and Moscow for you tonight, but that is the news of the world. We'll be back with you at frequent intervals, but now, this is Robert St. John saying goodbye.
The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated stations will bring you all the news of the invasion as rapidly as it is received. Ever since the first news of the invasion was received shortly after midnight and continuing throughout the early hours of the morning, most of the stations affiliated with the National Broadcasting Company have been bringing you news and commentary on the greatest invasion in the history of warfare. These stations will continue to serve you throughout the night so long as events warrant continuous broadcasting. This is the National Broadcasting Company. We take you now to Hollywood.
But we bring you Ronald Colman with an exclusive feature in the NBC presentation of the events which are shaping history this day. Now, Mr. Colman.
Especially for this broadcast over NBC, Miss Edna St. Vincent Millay has written a poem and prayer for an invading army. They must not go alone into that burning building which today is all of Europe. Say that you go with them, spirit and heart and mind. Although the body, grown too old to fight a young man's war, or wounded too deeply under the healed and whitened scars of earlier battles, must remain behind. You, too, may not be with them, save in spirit. You, so greatly needed here in the very van and front of duty, to fashion tools and engines, and to engineer their transports, build the ships and mine the coal, without which all their efforts would be worse than vain. You, men and women, working in the workshops, working on the farms, makers of tools and of engines, fitters of wings to metal birds which have not left the nest, which yet must try their flight, sowers of seed in season, and planters of little plants at intervals, on acres newly plowed and disked and harrowed to feed a starving world. You workers in the shipyards, building ships which crowd each other down the way, you miners of coal in dark and dangerous corridors, who see the sun total eclipse each morning, disappearing, as you do, under the earth's rim, not to emerge into the daylight until the day is over and the lights dim. All you, without whose constant effort and whose skill, without whose loyal and unfailing aid, our men would stand stranded upon a foreign and a hostile shore, without so much as a stout stick to beat away death or pain. Bullets like angry hornets, buzzing round the ears and the bewildered brain. And from the sky again and yet again the downpour of heavy, evil, accurate, murderous rain. You who have stood behind them through this hour, move strong from behind them now. Let's still the weary bones encase the indefatigable will. But how can men draw near so fierce a conflagration? Even here, across a gray and cold and foggy sea, its heat is felt. Why, touch your cheek. Is it not hot and tight and dry? And look what light climbs up the eastern sky and sinks and climbs again. Like to the bright aurora of the north, it floods and flashes, pulses, pales, then glows, lighting the entire east majestically, as if it were the sun that rose. I wish it were. Surely our fiber and sinew, the backbone and brain of us, are made of some less common stuff than clay. Surely the blood which warms the veins of heroes at the front, our brothers and our sons, runs also in our own. And are we not then capable, perhaps, of something more courageous than we yet have shown? Surely some talisman, some token of our lofty pride in them, our heavy gratitude, and so much love will find its way to them? Some messenger, the vicar and the angels of what we feel, will fly before them where they fly, before them and above, like patron goddesses in wars of old, cleaving with level, lovely brows the hard air before the eager prows, lighting their way with incandescent wings and winged heel. This is the hour. This is the appointed time. The sound of the clock falls awful on our ears, as the sound of the bells, their metal clang and chime, tolling for those about to die. For we know well they will not all come home to lie in summer on the beaches. And yet, weep not, you mothers of young men, their wives, their sweethearts, all who love them well. Fear not the tolling of the solemn bell. It does not prophesy, and it cannot foretell. It only can record. And it records today the passing of a most uncivil age, which had its elegance, but lived too well and far too long, and which on history's page will be found guilty of injustice and grave wrong. O thou Prince of Peace, this is a prayer for war. Yet not a war of man against his fellow man. Say rather, Lord, we do beseech thy guidance and thy help in exorcising from the mind of man, where she has made her nest, a hideous and most fertile beast. And this to bring about with all dispatch, for look, where even now she would lie down again to whelp. Lord God of hosts, thou Lord of hosts not only, not alone of battling armies, Lord and King, but of the childlike heart as well, which longs to put away, oh, not the childish, but the adult, circuitous, and adroit, antique, and violent thing called war, and sing the beauties of this late to come, but oh, so lovely spring. For see, where our young men go forth in mighty numbers to set free from torture and from every jeopardy things that are dear to thee. Keep in thy loving care, we pray, those of our fighting men whose happy fortune it may be to come back home again after the war is over, and all those who must perforce remain, the mourned, the valiant slain. This we beseech thee, Lord. And now, before we rise from kneeling, one thing more. Soften our hard and angry hearts. Make us ashamed of doing what we do, beneath thy very eyes, knowing it does displease thee. Make us more humble, Lord, for we are proud without sufficient reason. Let our necks be bowed more often to thy will, for well we know what deeds find favor in thy sight, and still we do not do them. O Lord, all through the night, all through the day, keep watch over our brave and dear, so far away. Make us more worthy of their valor and thy love. Let them come home. Oh, let the battle, Lord, be brief, and let our boys come home. So cries the heart, sick for relief from its anxiety, and seeking to forestall a certain and a greater grief. So cries the heart aloud, but the thoughtful mind has something of its own to say. On that day, when they come home from very far away, and further than you think, for each of them has stood upon the very brink, or sat and waited in the anteroom of death, expecting every moment to be called by name. Now, look you to this matter well, that they upon returning shall not find, seated at their own tables, at the head perhaps of the long festive board, trinked out in prodigal array, the very monster which they sallied forth to conquer and to quell, and left behind for dead. Let us forget such words and all they mean as hatred, bitterness, rancor, greed, intolerance, bigotry. Let us renew our faith and pledge to man his right to be himself and free. Say that the victory is ours. Then say, and each must search his heart in true humility, Lord, Father, Who are we that we should wield so great a weapon for the right and rehabilitation of thy creature, man? Lo, from all corners of the earth we ask all great and noble to come forth, converge upon this errand, in this task, with generous and gigantic plans. Hold high this torch who will, lift up this sword who can.
You have heard Ronald Colman in a poem and prayer for an invading army, written especially for this broadcast by Miss Edna St. Vincent Millay. This first reading of the poem was an exclusive feature in the NBC presentation of the world-shaking events of the day. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The greatest army in history is battering at Fortress Europe. In addition to special news broadcasts, NBC will bring you the latest bulletins as soon as received. Stay tuned to WEAF New York. Having canceled all regularly scheduled programs, NBC invites you to listen tonight at 8 o'clock over most of these stations to Ginny Sims in a program especially arranged for this Invasion Day. Keep tuned all night to NBC for the latest bulletins as they come from the fighting fronts. As part of its invasion coverage, the National Broadcasting Company presents H.V. Kaltenborn with the news and his own analysis of today's momentous events. Mr. Kaltenborn hopes in the course of tonight's program to call in London to interview Brigadier General Smythe, military correspondent of the Kensley newspaper chain. And now here is Mr. Kaltenborn.
Good evening, everybody. Unfortunately, we have just been advised from London that our two-way conversation with General Smythe cannot be set up for tonight. However, we hope to bring it to you tomorrow night and perhaps on other nights of the week when there will be something important to report from London. Supreme Allied Headquarters issued the first report on invasion progress shortly after 6 o'clock tonight. The official Allied communique says Allied forces succeeded in their initial landings. Fighting continues. This means, so far, invasion is successful. Our first objectives were achieved. Losses were low. Allied assault forces met little opposition in the Channel or in the air. German coast defenses were weaker than we expected. The British Air Ministry reveals tonight that since May 7th, our planes have hammered huge German naval guns embedded in concrete casemates. Those that stored up on the invasion coast, they have not proved effective. There are indications that tactical surprise has been attained by us at many points. Our control of the sea and of the air gave us speedy control of important points on the French Normandy coast. Intensive air bombardment had eliminated much German coastal artillery. Well over 1,000 troop-carrying aircraft, including gliders, participated in the airborne phase of the invasion. A record use of that kind of air material. More than 4,000 ships and 11,000 first-line planes participated in today's operations. 2 more records. Among the ships that bombarded the French coast were the United States cruisers Augusta and Tuscaloosa and the battleship Nevada. The President told us that up to noon we had lost only 2 destroyers and 1 small landing ship tank. General Eisenhower says the naval casualties were very light, especially considering the many ships involved. Air losses totaled 1%, a low figure. The 8th Air Force announces the loss today of only 4 bombers and 7 fighters after hitting more than 100 coastal defense targets. It is significant that Air Marshal Goering said today invasion must be defeated even if it means the death of the Luftwaffe. Tonight, it looks as though that is just what it does mean. President Roosevelt said channel weather was the factor which determined the invasion date. D-Day was set for late May or early June. Bad weather finally delayed invasion 24 hours more. Our first major objective appears to be the Normandy Peninsula. Cherbourg is at the tip of that peninsula, and the historic river port of Cannes is its most important railroad center. Our troops have reached Caen, 10 miles inland, and are fighting for the town. On the flat north coast of Normandy, we have control of a beachhead 16 miles long and several miles deep. Bulldozers are already preparing an airstrip near the beach. So far, we have achieved some surprise and much progress. We are pouring in reinforcements. Large numbers of tanks were landed with our troops. Tank battles have developed. Tomorrow, or the day after, the crucial test of our invasion will begin. The Germans will then strike their heavy blows against our beachheads. The barometer is falling tonight in the Dover Straits area. This means unsettled weather, which will make our additional landings a little more difficult. If we can hold our established bases against these first counter-blows, we can expand them soon thereafter. Our headquarters expects the first heavy counterattacks to be launched within 48 hours. Our reconnaissance tells us that it is coming. German and Allied reports both indicate that we have now established three main beachheads. One, at the mouth of the Orne River. This is on the east coast of the Normandy Peninsula, 25 miles east of Le Havre. The Allies have driven into the stone-housed streets of Caen, where William the Conqueror, in 1066, assembled the fleet with which he invaded England. This part of the Normandy coast is flat. It is ideal for airborne landings. Two, on the east side of the Normandy Peninsula, at the mouth of the Vire River. This second beachhead is 40 miles northwest of Caen. Caen, by the way, is spelled C-A-E-N. It is near Isigny on your map, spelled I-S-I-G-N-Y. Three, on the east side of the Normandy Peninsula, where the Allied troops, according to the Germans, straddled the Cherbourg, Carentan, Valognes road. This landing is just back of Cherbourg. It has already been reinforced and is intended to give us control of the great port of Cherbourg. Familiar to us all as transatlantic travelers. Tonight, a huge Allied naval squadron is cruising off Cherbourg. It is possible that General de Gaulle is on one of these ships ready to land on his native soil. There were other landings near Havre and the Seine estuary, and possibly between Havre and Dunkirk. These, however, may have been mere commando raids to deceive the Germans. There is also a Berlin report that we have invaded the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey off the Normandy coast. This sounds plausible as part of the Normandy operation. We must not be boastful, but at the end of this first invasion day, I cannot help asking these questions. Where is Hitler's Atlantic wall that was to prevent invasion? Where is the hoarded Luftwaffe that was to defeat invasion? Where are the secret weapons that were to be the undoing of invasion? Where is the counter-invasion that was to surprise the British? Perhaps we can find the answer to all these questions in the simple phrase used by General Eisenhower as dawn broke this morning. He smiled and said, "The sun has come out. Today, it is the sun of victory."
Oh, Mr. Kaltenborn, we've established contact with Brigadier General Smythe, and he's waiting to talk to you now from London. If you'll just use these earphones, you'll hear his voice.
Righto. General Smythe, can you hear me? Hello, General Smythe in London. I'm going to put to you some questions which you, as the military correspondent of the Kensley newspaper chain in Britain, will probably be able to answer. Question 1. Why have we landed on the Normandy coast 80 miles from Britain instead of across the Straits of Dover, only 20 miles from Britain? If you will be patient, I think the General has heard us. As you know, we've been having a little trouble all day in getting directly through. But frequently, we do get through after a few moments' delay. We're calling General Smythe in London, putting questions to him concerning the invasion. Just before the broadcast began, we were told we couldn't get through. Then, shortly after I went on the air, we were told that we could get through. Now, we've tried, and it seems that we cannot get through. Well, we'll try it again tomorrow night. In any case, you'll be interested in the questions that I wanted to ask this British general. And the first question is, why have we landed on the Normandy coast, 80 miles from Britain, instead of across the Straits of Dover, only 20 miles from Britain? My guess is that he would answer that the Germans had expected us across the Dover Straits, had made their strongest defense preparations in that area, had not expected us to land on the coast of Normandy, therefore were not as well prepared for us there as they were opposite Dover. My second question, what do you consider the outstanding achievement so far registered by our invasion forces? Well, if I were General Smythe, which I am not, I would probably say that the outstanding achievement is to make the landings successfully with very low losses, to have succeeded in placing troops on 3 points of Normandy at a negligible loss in naval vessels, at only a 1% loss in aircraft. In other words, what was the hardest phase of the invasion is accomplished on the first day with relatively minor losses. And my third question, is this our greatest single effort, or are we still capable of making landings in equal force at other points on the invasion coasts of Europe? And I should answer my own question by saying the number of troops that we have landed so far is negligible compared to the number that we have available, and we will be able to make other invasion efforts at other points. For the first time since the war began, the Allies are waiting for the creation of a second front by Russia, probably within 24 to 48 hours, and almost certainly before the end of the week, Soviet armies are expected to throw their demonstrated vast power into a new offensive, synchronized with the Anglo-American invasion of Western Europe. Joint Allied operations, driving against Germany from both east and west, was worked out at the Tehran Conference. The plan is to knock Germany out of the war this year by a many-sided offensive. Soviet artillery on the lower Dniester front is already stepping up the tempo of its barrage. Huge Soviet forces have completed regrouping operations in that area and are believed ready to strike. Russia today has close to 300 divisions and 5 million front-line fighters ready to strike a decisive blow against the common enemy. Thousands of planes and tanks and Cossack cavalrymen are standing alert along the vast Russian front. 7 weeks of preparation for the new offensive finds the Red Army ready. Today witnessed the first American bomber raid from our new bases in Soviet Russia. They showered tons of explosives on Galatz, Romania, and then returned to their Russian bases. They are ready to play their part in Russia's forthcoming offensive. The Germans expect a Russian blow on their southern flank. That explains the recent German counterattacks on the Jassy area of Romania, which have made little progress. And here are 2 bulletins from other fronts. The United Nations radio at Algiers says that Allied armored forces were already at a point about 9 miles beyond the Tiber River, and that the Germans were falling back in some disorder to the north and west of Rome. Let us not forget the tremendous importance of the Italian front, our great victory in the conquest of Rome, and now our successful pursuit of the defeated German armies. And MacArthur's headquarters, down in the southwest Pacific, says that American invasion troops on Biak Island, off New Guinea, have now battled to within 1.5 miles of Makmur Airfield, so that there, too, we are about to achieve an important victory in securing control of this airfield within only 900 miles of the Philippine Islands. And on this day, as we look over the war effort of the United Nations, climaxed by the great invasion that was so well launched, we cannot help but feel thankful that fate has given us this opportunity to play this great role in this world drama. And every church in New York City, and I am told in almost every city in the land, today has been filled with devout worshippers who pray to God that our troops may safely accomplish their great mission. Rarely have the churches of this country held a throng so devout, so reverent, so eager to supplicate God for his merciful intervention in this great struggle of all time. And at 10 o'clock tonight, the President of the United States will voice that same prayer that is in the hearts of all our people. Good night.
Good night, Mr. Kaltenborn. As part of its invasion coverage, the National Broadcasting Company has presented H.V. Kaltenborn, Dean of American News Commentators, with the news and his own analysis of today's momentous events. This is the National Broadcasting Company. NBC is standing by to bring you the complete news coverage of the invasion. WEAF news broadcasts will continue through the night, and invasion bulletins broadcast as received.
Now, the makers of Phillips Milk and Magnesia tablets present Amanda of Honeymoon Hill, radio's drama of love and life in wartime in the romantic South. The story of a beautiful valley girl, Amanda Dyke, who married the son of the aristocratic family up on the hill, Edward Layton. Today, at the end of our show, a special appeal will be made to every woman in America who is eligible to join the Waves. Hundreds of thousands of Waves are needed urgently, at once. Full details will be given at the end of the broadcast. And now for our drama, Amanda of Honeymoon Hill. Amanda is troubled, deeply troubled. She is thinking,
ever since Edward and I had to leave our lovely home in Virginia, come here to Washington to live, we've been plunged into such a different world. Of course, we had to come when Edward was given such an important war job, assisting Mr. Foster in his huge airplane factory. Of course, I wanted to come with him when he said he needed me here, but... Well, now we've had to move into Mr. Foster's home, Edward and I. Oh, it's a beautiful place here in Chevy Chase. We have our own little suite of rooms. Mr. and Mrs. Foster are both so good to us. But I don't want to seem ungrateful, truly, but I do so wish Edward and I could be alone, that we didn't have to live with them and with Bettina.
If Amanda knew the full truth, she'd wish far more urgently that she didn't have to live in the same house with Bettina Foster. For Bettina, the glamorous, unscrupulous daughter of Edward Layton's employer, is greatly attracted to Edward. Under a pretense of friendliness to Amanda, Bettina is bent on making trouble for her. And last night, Bettina did her best to stir up trouble between her young cousin, Jeanette Lawrence, and Jeanette's soldier husband who was away at camp. Now it's after dinner, and Edward and Amanda are talking in the sitting room of their suite in the Foster home.
That was Jeanette who just telephoned me, Edward. She asked me if I could meet her tonight or if she could come here to see me for a little while. Of course, I told her to come here.
I'm so glad you did, darling. In 10 or 15 minutes, I'll have to leave you and join Mr. Foster in the library. We have a lot of work to go over, but I do hate walking out on you when you've no other plans for tonight.
Oh, darling, I've 1,000,001 things I ought to be doing. Stockings to wash and buttons to sew on your shirts, things like that. You don't have to worry ever, dear, about leaving me alone. Your work is the important thing.
I know, but just the same, I do worry, Amanda, darling. I'm so afraid that you'll get thinking of home and Robert Elijah and missing him too much.
I do miss him, Edward. I wouldn't be a mother if I didn't miss my baby terribly. But tonight, well, leaving him in our home so I could be with you, that's my war job, Edward. And we do have each other. Look at poor Jeanette. She's all alone.
Yes, poor kid. It's tough on her and on all the young wives who have to carry on alone while their husbands are in the service. But she's a brave girl, and...
Yes, she has been brave, Edward, all along. So brave. But now, and Bettina's... Oh, darling, I've been so upset all day remembering the things that Bettina said last night.
Huh? What things?
To Jeanette, of course. Oh, Edward, I forgot I haven't told you about that. I haven't truly had a chance. Well, you know Bettina and I had dinner last night at Jeanette's apartment.
Yes, and you did tell me what a charming little apartment it is, and how much Jeanette loves it because it's her first real home.
She almost had me crying, Edward, when she told me how she and Jack chose all the furnishings together before he went into the army, and how she's working so hard to keep the home for him till he comes back. She loves him so much, and she needs so terribly to believe in his love for her.
Well, from all I've heard, he does love her with all his heart. And from what Jeanette said, I'm sure they're a particularly devoted couple.
I think so, too, Edward. Well, for 2 whole weeks now, Jeanette hasn't had a letter from him. Not a single line. Though she writes him every day, and she's nearly frantic, of course.
Oh, I see. Yes, of course that's tough on her, but she's foolish to be so anxious. If her husband had been sent overseas, Jeanette would have received a notification of an APO address.
Oh, well, that's not what's worrying her so terribly, Edward. She's not afraid Jack's been sent out of the country.
Well, then what?
It's the things that Bettina keeps telling her. Bettina says that, well, that with a man, new places mean new faces. That out of sight's out of mind.
Oh, rot. Surely, Amanda, Jeanette doesn't believe
Doesn't
that.
want to believe Jack could forget her or deliberately neglect her, but she... Well, Edward, you know how Jeanette's always lived in Bettina's shadow and is influenced by Bettina's opinions. And every time that Bettina sees Jeanette, she keeps telling her
I can imagine. I can well imagine the poisonous doubts that Bettina would express. I suppose she has Jack spending his evenings with some other girl, having himself a heck of a good time and forgetting his wife entirely.
That's it exactly, Edward. It's just the very things Bettina keeps saying.
Then she ought to have her mouth washed out with soap. That's despicable. It's worse than that. It's almost a form of treason. Army officers have emphasized over and over how important it is to a soldier's morale for him to have complete faith in his wife and to know that she has complete faith in him. And for an outsider to destroy that faith, well, it's like destroying one of our soldiers. It's aiding the enemy.
Edward, I wish Bettina could hear you saying that. Or that I'd been able to put it to her that way, so clearly and sternly. I did tell her she was wrong, all wrong, talking to Jeanette like that, but I wasn't able to stop her.
And couldn't Jeanette stop her?
No, she was too upset, all overwrought, crying. Oh, Edward, I'm so sorry for her, because I know how she feels. It really isn't that Jeanette lacks faith in Jack. It's herself she doubts.
Herself? Well, just what do you mean, Amanda?
Well, it's sort of hard to express, but you know how it's been with Jeanette, growing up a poor relation in this house, always having to be grateful for hand-me-down clothes. And she never was as pretty as Bettina, nor as clever, and she never really expected much happiness for herself.
But she did find happiness with Jack.
Yes, but it was never a happiness she could take for granted. Because to Jeanette, it seemed like a miracle that Jack should love her and choose her to marry. Edward, you know, darling, it's so easy to doubt a miracle. Especially with Bettina constantly telling her Jack's probably stepping out with some other girl.
Well, if Jeanette believes that, then she deserves to be unhappy.
Edward, darling, you don't truly understand. I don't suppose any man could understand just how Jeanette feels. But that's the way women are made. And Bettina's so clever. The way she can twist things. Why, last night she was advising Jeanette to write Jack a scorching letter.
And will you tell me, please, just where Bettina gets off advising other women how to handle their husbands when she hasn't managed to get one of her own? Hasn't anyone ever told Bettina that she hasn't done so well for herself?
No, I don't suppose anyone's ever dared to tell Bettina that. But, darling, if anyone tried, she has her answer already.
Her answer?
Yes. She'd say that, well, that she had loads and loads of chances to marry. That men have been trying to marry her since she was 18, but that she always gets tired of a man by the time he proposes. So she refuses him.
I think you have something there. Yes, that's just about what Bettina would say. You made a pretty shrewd guess, Amanda.
Oh, it's more than a guess. Well, only the other day, Bettina was telling me that the really popular girl, the one who's sure of her beauty and charm for men, she never marries very young. She said that the girl who's never had a sweetheart before and is afraid she'll never get another grabs at the very first man she can get and then marries him before he quite knows what's happening to him.
Well, I'll be darned. That beats anything I've ever heard. So marrying young is a proof of unattractiveness in a woman. And being unmarried at 29, Bettina must be all of that, as proof of her devastating charm.
Well, yes, that's the general idea. It means that Bettina's so sure she can get a husband anytime she wants that she doesn't have to hurry. Poor Jeanette and I, why, we just had to take what we could get while the going was good.
Take it and like it, I hope. You do still like being married to me, Mrs. Layton?
Well, I managed to stand it, Mr. Layton. Edward, darling, you're picking up your briefcase. Oh, and that means...
Yes, I'm afraid it does. It means that I'm going to take time to kiss you just once, and then I must hie me downstairs for that conference in the library with Mr. Foster. And it'll give you a good chance to talk to Jeanette and try to knock some sense into her head. She ought to be here soon.
I'll do my best, darling. I only wish that you could talk to her yourself.
I will sometime, when I get a good chance. Goodbye, darling.
Bye.
Don't wait up for me. I may be very late.
I must remember what Edward said. Every word of it, so that I can tell Jeanette. Army officers have told us over and over how important it is to a soldier's morale for him to have complete faith in his wife and to know that she has complete faith in him. There she is now. Come on in. Oh, Jeanette, darling, I'm so... Oh, Bettina, it's you.
Yes, it's expecting Jeanette? I didn't know.
Well, she just telephoned a little while ago that she was coming over.
To see you? Well, then maybe you'd rather that... I only came up because I thought you'd be alone.
Now, don't be foolish, Bettina. She'll want to see you, of course. Sit down, please. Make yourself comfortable.
Well, it seems very queer that Jeanette didn't telephone me. After all, she's my cousin.
That must be Jeanette now. Jeanette, dear, I was beginning to be afraid that you were lost. Why, Jeanette, whatever's wrong?
That's what I came to tell you, Amanda. Oh, hello, Bettina.
Jeanette Lawrence, you don't look like something the cat dragged in. You're as white as paper. Your eyes are like two burnt holes in a blanket. What have you been doing, crying yourself sick over Jack?
No, Bettina. I'm through with crying. Through with being a trusting little fool. I've taken your advice. Last night after you left, I wrote Jack that letter, and the things I said fairly scorched the paper.
Oh, Jeanette, you didn't. Jeanette, you mustn't mail it.
It's already mailed. I went right out to a post office the minute I'd finished and sent it airmail.
Good. I only hope you told him plenty.
Yes, I told him. I told him I wouldn't stand for it, being treated this way, being neglected and tricked while he...
Jeanette. Oh, my dear, my poor dear.
For heaven's sakes, let's not have a scene. Just when Jeanette's beginning to show some gumption. My dear, you were perfectly right to send that letter. I'm proud of you.
Leave me alone. Leave me alone. You made me write that letter, Bettina. And I hope you're satisfied. Because I'd give my right hand if only I'd never written it. If only I could take it back.
But not all the wishing in the world can bring back a letter that's been written and mailed. These poisoned darts of words that Jeanette put on paper are winging their way to pierce the heart of her soldier husband. What will Jack Lawrence do when he receives that letter? And now that she has done her worst with Jeanette, what new trouble is Bettina to make for Amanda? Today we make an urgent appeal to the women of America to join the waves. As you know, our American Navy has now become the biggest in the world, in a growth so quick, so rapid, it is non-paralleled in history. This rapid growth of the Navy has made it necessary now, today, for the Navy to call upon the women of America for one of the most important jobs women have been asked to do in this war, to enlist by the thousands as waves. You're needed to put on the glorious blue uniform of the Navy, to step in and free a sailor from a shore job so that he can take his place on one of the hundreds of new Navy ships and planes which must now go forward to fight in the fiercest battles of the war. As a wave, you may help direct the takeoff and landing of Navy planes as a control tower operator, send and receive important code messages, help locate men and ships at sea, make up weather charts, and so forth. The only qualifications to become a wave are you must be an American citizen, 20 to 35 years old, with at least 2 years of high school or business school training, and no children under 18. The age limit for officers is 20 to 49 years. For full details, go to your nearest Navy recruiting station today. Do this at once, today. Our American Navy needs you as a wave in order to use its mighty strength most effectively in the days just ahead. Amanda of Honeymoon Hill is presented each day at this time by the makers of Phillips Milk of Magnesia tablets. Don't miss our broadcast tomorrow. And please stay tuned for Second Husband, which follows immediately. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Now, Second Husband, starring Helen Menken as Brenda Cummings. Second Husband is presented by the makers of Dr. Lyon's Tooth Powder. Brenda has just delivered an ultimatum to her 16-year-old daughter, Fran, and to Elsa King, that Fran is to leave Elsa's house and come home by the next day, even though Fran wants to stay. declaring that she doesn't like her own home anymore, preferring Elsa's, where she considers herself understood. Elsa's understanding of Fran consists of two things: trying to put the girl on the stage against Brenda's wishes and turning her against her mother. Brenda is desperate to know how to combat Elsa's influence. And as soon as she reaches her apartment, she goes to her old friend Ben for advice.
Brenda, honey, what's the matter? Did you find Fran real sick?
Oh, she's sick, Ben. Way you mean?
Why, what's wrong with her?
Oh, what's wrong with her is Elsa King.
Huh?
Ben, I'm frightened out of my wits. I really am. That woman has taken my daughter and made her into someone else. Why, you wouldn't know her if you heard her talk.
Now, wait a minute. I don't get this. What are you trying to tell me?
That Elsa King, bit by bit, word by word, has made Fran believe horrible things about me.
But...
that I don't love her, that I'm jealous of any possible career that she might have, and above all, that I don't understand her.
Come now, honey. Fran knows better than such tomfool stuff. Why, she's got a mind of her own. She ain't going to let a woman that she's known a week tell her what to think about you that she's known for 16 years.
Yes, but it's happened, Ben. I haven't exaggerated a word.
Well, you don't think you have, but it's all in your head.
Oh.
Why, there can't a word of it be true.
But Fran said those very words to me, Ben.
I don't believe it. Not Fran, not to you.
I know. I couldn't believe it myself. It kept going through my head as I stood there listening to her that, well, this isn't my daughter, Fran. None of this is happening. But it was, Fran. And it did happen, Ben. What am I going to do?
Did you come off and leave Fran with that woman?
She wouldn't come along with me. At first they pretended it was because Fran was too sick to be moved. But she wasn't that sick, Ben. She just didn't want to come. And finally, she said so to me.
Well, I don't care what she said. She hadn't ought to be left around that... Well, I ain't in the habit of calling ladies names, but I'd sure like to call that one some right now.
Oh, Ben, I didn't want to leave Fran there, but I couldn't pick her up bodily and carry her off. And she wouldn't obey me. Do you hear that, Ben? Fran, who's always been the most obedient child in the world, defied me completely.
Well, I can pick her up bodily and carry her off, and what's more, I'll do it.
Well, I told them that you'd come for Fran tomorrow, Ben.
Tonight, this minute. I ain't going to have her there. And as soon as I get her here, I'm going to give her a good licking. She ain't too big for one. She's proved that.
But I'm afraid none of that is going to solve the problem, Ben. It's a bigger thing than you know, perhaps bigger than I know. But I do know this much. It's not going to be easy to lead Fran back to being her old self again.
Well, what in tarnation made that Elsie want to change her? Wasn't Fran all right the way she was?
Well, we know how it all began, Ben. Elsa King's determination to put Fran into that first show that she was producing. But it's even gone further than that now. I think that, well, Elsa King is neurotic in the extreme, and in some twisted way, she really thinks of Fran as her own daughter, really believes that she has the right to control her and plan for her. And that's what makes all this truly dangerous, Ben. So, how do you handle a thing like that? I don't know where to begin. I just don't know.
Brenda, I ain't so sure that you're right. Now, if you ask me, Elsie King is nothing more nor less than a spoiled woman that wants her own way. Now, she wanted Fran in her play, and you balked her. She's fit to be tied, that anyone would dare to stand up to her. So she's doing everything low and sneaking that she can to get back at you. Now, all that other stuff about her thinking that Fran's her daughter just don't make good sense.
Well, good sense or not, Ben, it's true. I know it is. And I've got to combat it some way, somehow, for Fran's sake. Elsa's got to be made to stop undermining my daughter's faith in me. But how to do it, Ben? How?
Oh, honey, you got me out of my depth. Folks don't act that way where I come from. All I got to say is that I wish Elsie King was a man, because it'd pleasure me considerable to knock someone down that's acting the way she is.
Well, if Grant were only here, he'd know what to do. Oh, but he's not here. He's fighting a war on the other side of the world, and I'm fighting one of my own right here.
Yeah, likely Grant'd know what to do.
Oh, Ben.
Huh?
What about Mildred?
But now, don't go talking about Mildred. I'm mad enough as it is. If I got to thinking about that sister of yours, I'd like as not blow up. She started this here whole thing in the beginning.
That's just it, Ben. She did start it.
Ah.
And she apparently has some influence with Elsa King, or she could never have got her interested in my daughter, Fran. Maybe we could get her to use that influence for the good, Ben.
Any time Mildred Turner uses her influence for the good, I'll know the world's coming to an end.
But she might, Ben. She just might. It's worth the trying. Anything is worth trying.
You can try, but I'll tell you before you start, you might as well save your breath.
Well, you're probably right. Even though I think Fran is too inexperienced, Mildred thinks Fran should go on the stage, and she's already against me. But still in all, Ben,
She doesn't know these other things about Elsa, what she's doing to Fran. So maybe if I told her right now...
And maybe not. You know Mildred ain't never agreed with anyone in her family yet. There ain't no reason to believe that she's going to change now.
Yes, but she loves Fran. She wouldn't want to hurt Fran or
I heard
see
my
her...
name. What are you two saying about me behind my back? I hope it's nice.
Well, I'll tell you what we were saying. We were saying that...
Mildred, I need your help desperately. I need you desperately.
Why, Brenda, darling, of course. What can I do? Whatever's wrong?
Well, you see, it's Fran.
Now, Brenda, for heaven's sake, if that's what you want my help about, you've come to the wrong person. You know very well that I think Fran should start her career now. And I'm not so wishy-washy that I can alter my firm convictions just to please you.
No. It's not the stage this time, Mildred. It's something else. Something that you haven't heard about. You see, Fran wants to stay at Elsa King's. She doesn't want to come home. She wants
Does Elsa want her?
Well, that's what I'm trying to tell you, Mildred. Elsa is keeping her there. She's keeping...
How marvelous. Isn't Fran the lucky girl? That beautiful house, all those servants. How I envy her.
Mildred, you don't understand. Elsa has turned Fran against me, against her own home.
Oh, how utterly silly, Brenda.
But it's true. It's true, and I've got to get her away from there. Don't you see, Mildred?
I certainly don't see. What I see is that you've got the most ridiculous and macabre imagination, and that you're overwrought. You need a vacation. I've always said you work too hard. And that's one perfectly good reason why you should let Fran go on the stage and make some money for you.
Listen to her. The same old thing. Same old Mildred.
You keep out of this, Ben Porter. I've nothing to say to you.
Well, I'm glad of that, but I got plenty to say to you. Now, you look here, Mildred. You started this thing with Elsie King, and now you can just unstart it.
I started it?
Yes.
Started what?
No, it's no use, Ben. You see, Mildred won't help us.
Well, it ain't no disappointment to me, because I never expected her to.
But I don't understand what I'm expected to do.
Mildred, would it do any good for me to tell you?
Not a lick.
Tell me. At least I'd like to get this straight.
You never had anything straight in your life.
Brenda, if you don't stop Ben talking to me this way, I won't listen to a word.
Please, Ben, please.
Oh, excuse me, Mildred. I wouldn't get you ruffled up for the world. No, I take it all back. I never meant a word of it. I think you're the smartest, best, helpfulest lady in the world. Now, does that suit you?
Your sarcasm leaves me unmoved.
Well, ain't that a pity?
No, Ben. All of this doesn't help. Be quiet, please, so I can tell Mildred what I wanted to do.
All right, honey, all right. Not a peep out of me.
All right, then. Mildred, if you'd go to Elsa King and tell her that she's hurting Fran, really hurting her, by mixing up her mind and taking away all her beliefs, then maybe she'd stop. I told her, but she wouldn't listen to me. Elsa King doesn't like me. She likes you. Will you do that for me, Mildred?
But, Brenda, it's all so fantastic.
Fantastic or not, it's what's happening, I know. I've seen Fran, and I tell you that she's changed already, and she'll change all the more. So, will you go to Elsa and try and show her what she's doing?
My dear Brenda, I wouldn't dare have the effrontery to tell Elsa what to do. How could I interfere?
How could you interfere? Well, I'm a piebald pony. To think I live to see the day that Mildred Turner says she can't interfere with no one. Hers wouldn't bat an eye to interfere with a king on his throne if she had the mind to. I don't know how you got the gall to stand there and speak those words, any more than I can see how you got the nerve to refuse your own sister when you started the trouble to begin with. Ain't you the least bit ashamed, is what I want to know, ain't you?
Brenda, if you can keep Ben quiet for one peaceful minute, I have something I'd like to say to you.
Never mind about me. I'm getting out of here. I can't stand to hear no more.
There you are now, Mildred. He's gone. Tell me what you have to say.
In spite of the fact that I think all this excitement is perfectly ridiculous, I'll speak to Elsa.
Oh, will you? Will you, Mildred? I'm sure it'll do some good. And I do thank you. Will you go and see her right now?
Oh, I suppose so. If I must, I must.
You know, Mildred, Ben's really wrong about you. Because sisters do stick together. And I knew that you'd help me in a crisis.
Is Ben so wrong? Will Mildred really help? Or will she, as is her habit, bungle things all the more? We'll find out tomorrow in Second Husband. And now, Miss Helen Mencken.
Today we should like to end our broadcast by the reading of this special Invasion Day prayer by the Right Reverend Henry St. George Tucker. Almighty and most merciful God, Father of all mankind, lover of every life, hear, we beseech thee, the cry of thy children in this dark hour of conflict and danger. Thou hast been the refuge and strength in all generations of those who put their trust in thee. May it please thee this day to draw to thyself the hearts of those who struggle and endure to the uttermost. Have mercy on them, and suffer not their faith in thee to fail. Guide and protect them by thy light and strength, that they may be kept from evil. May thy comfort be sufficient for all who suffer pain, or who wait in the agony of uncertainty. O righteous and most powerful God, who in their tragedies and conflicts judgest the hearts of men and purposes of nations, enter into this struggle with thy transforming power, that out of its anguish there may come a victory of righteousness. May there arise a new order which shall endure, because in it thy will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us and cleanse us, as well as those who strive against us, that we may be fit instruments of thy purposes. Unto thy most gracious keeping we commend our loved ones and ourselves, ascribing unto thee all praise and glory through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Second Husband, starring Helen Menken as Brenda Cummings, will be on the air at the same time tomorrow. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
At this time, CBS World News will attempt to bring you a scheduled address to the people of France by General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the French Committee of National Liberation. General de Gaulle will speak from London, and if we are able to pick up his talk, you will hear a running translation of his address by Beverly Thurman of Columbia's Shortwave News staff. This is CBS in New York, and in a few moments we will switch you to London for the scheduled address of General Charles de Gaulle. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for the General to begin, we might mention that it was announced only this morning that he had arrived in Britain. As you know, his trip to England has been planned for some time, and he is scheduled to discuss at length with Prime Minister Churchill and other leaders the problems of his committee. High on the list of subjects to be discussed, it is commonly believed, is the question of whether General de Gaulle's Committee of Liberation is to be granted full or provisional recognition as the present government of France. At the present time, the Committee of Liberation does not enjoy the recognition already granted to exiled governments of other occupied nations, which now have their headquarters in London. The news bulletin this morning announcing de Gaulle's arrival in London also mentioned that he has already had a first meeting with Mr. Churchill, shortly after the first news came of the invasion of his country by Allied troops. De Gaulle had apparently arrived some time before, but news of his presence in London had been held back for reasons of military security. We are still waiting for General de Gaulle to begin speaking in London. In the meanwhile, we'll bring you invasion news up to this moment. President Roosevelt summoned top Army and Navy chiefs to the White House today in Washington for an invasion conference, and he is preparing to lead the nation in a prayer which he wrote last night as the Allied Armada moved across the English Channel to France. Mr. Roosevelt called in General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, and General Henry Arnold, Commander of the Army Air Forces. Meanwhile, reports are pouring into the White House from the War and Navy departments on the progress of the invasion. When the invasion came early today, President Roosevelt was sound asleep, and the White House was quiet except for a message center through which came official reports of last-minute developments. The President retired early in the evening after his radio broadcast, but undoubtedly was up early canvassing the latest official dispatches. After the landing in France was announced, members of the White House staff remained in close touch with their offices, and the workday was expected to begin an hour or two earlier. Otherwise, the White House was quiet, with very few lights on, and no activity except in the press room where a group of reporters sat through much of the night waiting for any possible development from the President. The contrast with that other climactic occasion, December 7th, 1941, was marked. News of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was disseminated from the White House with, as one reporter recalled, a flash a minute. This time, the White House seemed to be sleeping through the first phases of the action. Here's a late bulletin from London which says that more than 1,000 American heavy bombers attacked enemy targets in France this morning in support of the invasion. Military observers in London said today that a general Russian offensive coordinated with the Anglo-American attack from the west may be launched within the next 48 hours, and almost certainly will begin before the weekend. News of the Allied landing in France spread swiftly throughout Russia today and touched off enthusiastic demonstrations such as rarely have been seen since the war began. American war correspondents in Moscow were the first to break the news, and they were quickly surrounded by cheering crowds who rushed to shake their hands and to offer congratulations. Radio Moscow's chief announcer, who customarily reads only Premier Stalin's orders of the day, broadcasted General Dwight D. Eisenhower's special communique announcing the landing. He read the bulletin in a solemn and triumphant tone, rivaling his best performance for the Red Army's biggest victory announcement. Soviet war marches, Yankee Doodle, and the triumphal music reserved for Stalin's victory orders followed the bulletin. For 2 weeks now, the Russian people have been expecting the invasion to begin at any moment. And the question on everyone's lips was, has it started? The Soviet people now are waiting for their own armies to strike from the east in the coordinated offensive mapped out at the Tehran conference. The Germans' Transocean News Agency said today that a battle was in progress in the English Channel north of Le Havre between German naval units and Allied forces attempting to make a landing. Nazi broadcasters said the Allies had won footholds on several islands off the coast of France. Earlier, they reported landings in the Channel Islands west of the Norman Peninsula. That's the Normandy Peninsula. The Transocean Agency reported that a naval battle was going on in the channel north of Le Havre between German units and Allied forces trying to make a landing. DNB, the official Nazi agency, said German counterthrusts were being undertaken east of Cherbourg, but the enemy keeps throwing the bulk of his troops into the area between Cherbourg and Ouistreham. The 28th and 101st American Parachute Divisions dropped in the Normandy area, DNB reported, adding the usual propaganda claim that many of these soldiers were captured. Ladies and gentlemen, this is CBS World News in New York. We had expected to bring you an address by General Charles de Gaulle speaking in London, but so far we've been unable to contact that point. Meanwhile, we're bringing you news of the invasion to bring you up to date on what has occurred in this biggest of all days, the invasion of Western Europe. An American war correspondent, Stanley Richardson, who has just returned from the Second Front beachhead with the first naval eyewitness of the operations. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're informed that we can hear from General de Gaulle in London. So we switch you now to London for the address by General de Gaulle.
1500 ans, gagner chacune de nos victoires, c'est ainsi que nous gagnerons celle-là. En bon ordre. Pour nos armées de terre, de mer, de l'air, il n'y a point là de problème. Jamais elles ne furent plus ardentes, plus habiles, plus disciplinées. L'Afrique, l'Italie, l'océan et le ciel ont vu leur force et leur gloire renaissantes. La terre natale les verra demain. Pour la nation qui se bat.
General de Gaulle says that never have France's forces of the air, sea, and land had such a glorious opportunity to distinguish themselves. And he speaks of the glories which the French armies have just achieved in the Italian campaign.
Gouvernement français et par les chefs français qu'il a qualifiés pour le faire à l'échelon national et à l'échelon local soit exactement suivi. La seconde est que l'action menée par nous sur les arrières de l'ennemi soit conjuguée aussi étroitement que possible avec celle que mènent de front les armées alliées.
General de Gaulle says that the first order which the French government has to give to the French forces will be followed exactly.
De l'action des forces de la résistance doit durer pour aller sans amplifiant jusqu'au moment de la déroute allemande. La troisième condition est que tous ceux qui sont capables d'agir, soit par les armes, soit par les destructions, soit par le renseignement.
General de Gaulle says that the action which the French armies will carry out with the Allies against the enemy will be exactly conjugated with those of the Allies.
Ou à la déportation, quelles que soient les difficultés, tout vaut mieux.
And with these actions, that of French resistance will also be combined.
La bataille de France a commencé. Il n'y a plus dans la nation, dans l'Empire, dans les armées, qu'une seule et même volonté, qu'une seule et même espérance. Derrière le nuage.
And General de Gaulle says it is absolutely necessary that all French patriots capable to act by arms and by refusing to work for the Germans should not allow themselves to be taken prisoner.
Le français qui vous est parvenu de Londres. Nous vous retournons au studio de la Voix de l'Amérique à New York.
And General de Gaulle said in concluding that the Battle of France has begun, and there is no longer except a single and sole will to conquer on the part of the French nation.
You have just heard a speech by General Charles de Gaulle, and its translation, a running translation of that speech, by Beverly Thurman of Columbia's shortwave news staff. General de Gaulle spoke to you from London. And now, here in CBS World News headquarters in New York, is Columbia's distinguished commentator, Mr. Quincy Howe.
The news of Allied landings on the north coast of France has given the war its most dramatic and sudden change since the Germans invaded Russia. Up to less than 12 hours ago, the Russians alone had engaged and defeated millions of German troops in vast land battles. Our North African and Italian campaigns had diverted some German strength from Russia, so had our preparations for invasion from the west. The fall of Mussolini in July and the fall of Rome day before yesterday hit German prestige hard throughout Europe. But until Anglo-American troops began to land in force in the west, it was toward the Russians that the Germans looked with fear and the people of the occupied countries with hope. Our landings have started to change all that, and the better and faster our campaign in the west develops, the more rapidly British and American prestige will grow in Western Europe. These landings differ from the invasion of Italy in at least two important respects. First, they show that Britain and the United States have developed first-rate military power on land as well as in the sea and on the air. We are now able to come to grips with the Germans in their own element, land fighting, and have already mastered our two elements, the air and the sea.
That was Columbia's analyst, Quincy Howe. Ladies and gentlemen, the following is the invasion prayer which President Roosevelt wrote while Allied troops were landing on the coast of France, and which he will read to the nation by radio at 10 p.m. Eastern Wartime tonight. My fellow Americans, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts,
steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. The enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again, and we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tired by night and by day, without rest till the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. These are men lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Many people have urged that I call the nation into a single day of special prayer. But because the road is long and the desire is great, I ask that our people devote themselves in continuance of prayer. As we rise to each new day, and again when each day is spent, let words of prayer be on our lips, invoking thy help to our efforts. Give us strength, too, strength in our daily tasks to redouble the contributions we make in the physical and material support of our armed forces. And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travel, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters, of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. With thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
Well, friends, the long-awaited D-Day is here. And in Littleton, as in thousands of other towns, hamlets, and cities throughout our country, the churches are open for prayer. Aunt Jenny herself has just returned and has been talking out by the front gate with Martha Reynolds, one of whose boys has been in England with the invasion forces. And here's Aunt Jenny now.
Folks, you heard what Danny just said, and I guess there's not one of us but has someone near and dear in the service of our country. A husband, a son, a sweetheart.
Or maybe the boy down the street who was just a kid only a few years ago.
That's right. And whoever they are, wherever they are, our hearts are with them today. And our thoughts go out especially to the men and boys who are invading Europe to bring liberty to the starving, conquered people.
And now the time's come that these oppressed nations have been looking forward to for so long.
And, ladies, it's up to us home folks to help our men and boys by keeping our faith in them strong and unwavering as they fight to stamp out the forces of evil and oppression. So now, friends, let's join in a brief prayer for the safety and success of our loved ones. Dear Heavenly Father, be with our boys today. They're fighting that liberty and right may prevail. Give them the strength that is beyond human strength. Sustain and comfort them, and grant that the light of victory may begin to shine in the not-too-distant future, and that our boys will come home to us again. Friends, for the sake of our dear ones in the service, let's all firmly resolve anew this day that we'll not relax our efforts, that we'll continue to do everything in our power to help win the war, to back up our brave fighting men and women. God bless them, every one.
And now for your story, Aunt Jenny.
Well, friends, you remember Claire Rogers was just like a daughter to old Anthony Abbott before he died. His only son, Jim, had run away from home years ago after an auto accident.
And then Jim came back to Littleton, not knowing his father was dead.
That's right, Danny. Martha Reynolds told him. She was at the traveler's aid desk that morning. She told him, too, that he'd inherited some money. But as she didn't know the name of his father's lawyer, she told him to go down to the newspaper office and talk to Calvin. Well, early that afternoon, Jim went to the Clarion office to get a copy of the newspaper carrying the notice of his father's death. And then Calvin was saying...
I was just going home for a bite of lunch, Mr. Abbott. Glad to share it with you.
Well, that's very kind of you, Mr. Wheeler, but I haven't time today.
Oh, that's too bad.
Here's the paper, Mr. Wheeler.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Pete.
The article about Mr. Abbott is on the front page, along with the pictures, boss.
Ah, good.
Why did Pete say that? I mean, how did he know that I wanted to see the article about Mr. Abbott?
Oh, people around the newspaper office have a way of putting one and two together. We don't always get the right answer. Sometimes we learn too late to our sorrow, but...
You and Pete recognize me, too.
Yes. I'd like to help you in any way I can, Mr. Abbott.
Thank you. But I'm not at all sure I'll stay here, and I had in mind slipping away with as little commotion as possible.
No explanation is necessary. If you don't find what you want in the paper, just let me know.
I decided I couldn't leave without going to my father's attorney. It was his name that I wanted to get from the paper without asking anyone for it directly.
Oh, I understand. Well, I'll tell you, he's Will Hunter. His office is 2 blocks down the street on the right-hand side in the yellow brick building in the center of the block.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and goodbye, sir.
Goodbye, and good luck, Jim.
You said it, boss. Good luck. That guy sure looks like he could stand a little luck.
Yes, he does, Pete.
Can you feature a trip like that? Being the son of good old Anthony Abbott, inheriting all that dough, and looking like such a sourpuss about it. Or was it an act, a cover-up? The fear would show how gosh all fire tickle he was, the nice old guy had kicked off.
I don't believe I saw Jim Abbott just like you did, Pete. His eyes were as gentle as a woman's. No, that's not it. They were...
Yeah, I know, boss. They looked like if he was a girl, he'd have been blubbering fit to drown us. And if it was an act, he could sure deliver the goods, costume and all. Boy, that suit's so thin that if he had sneezed real hard, it'd have been gone with the wind.
I'm Jim Abbott.
Well, how do you do? This is indeed a surprise. Do sit down, Mr. Abbott.
Thank you. I probably should have notified you that I was coming, but I didn't know that I was myself until about an hour ago.
You've been in town only an hour, Mr. Abbott, or may I call you Jim?
If you like. But about coming in town, I came in on an early train this morning, but...
Oh, I see. You mean that you only learned within the hour of your father's demise and the legacy he left you?
No, I learned of that soon after I arrived.
Oh, I see.
It took me some time to decide whether or not I wanted to make any inquiry about the money I was told my father had left me.
May I ask why you would have to decide on such a matter, Mr. Abbott?
Well, I think it's only fair to tell you that I still haven't made up my mind as to what I'll do in regard to it, but I would like very much to find out what my father's last wishes were and ask if he perhaps left any personal message for me.
Yes, Mr. Abbott, there's a letter, but I do not have it in my possession.
Well, where is it? Who has it?
A girl by the name of Claire Rogers has it. She came in after her work every day and cared for your father, and he loved her like a daughter.
Well, this girl was a nurse?
No, it seems your father befriended her when she came here some 6 or 7 years ago, and Claire never forgot it.
Oh, I see.
Now, as to the terms of the will, you are to receive a certain sum each month for the first year. The sum isn't large, but will be sufficient for your personal needs.
Well, I wasn't thinking of my current needs, Mr. Hunter. I'm able to manage. What I want is my father's letter to me.
Of course. I'll call Claire after her work and tell her you're coming for it. But first, I want to make the other terms of the will clear to you.
Very well, sir.
Briefly, they are this. After the year is up, you are to be given full possession of your father's entire legacy.
Well, I don't know that I'd feel right in taking it after the way I've...
In this matter, you do not have only yourself to consider, Jim. As the will, including your monthly allotment, is null and void unless you agree within 2 weeks' time to a certain stipulation your father has made.
Stipulation? Well, that doesn't sound like my father. But since he made it, he must have felt he had some good reason for it. And I couldn't blame him if he'd lost all faith in me.
His faith in you, Jim, never wavered. And the stipulation is that you marry Claire Rogers.
Marry?
Yes. Marry the girl who cared for your father so long.
Oh, but see here. The kind of a girl I'd want to marry wouldn't be the kind of a girl who'd have me.
I believe you'll regret having said that when you meet Claire Rogers.
I regret having said it now. I regret ever having to think such a thing about any girl or about myself. But look at me. Shabby, lame. I'd be a pretty poor bet for any girl, even with the money, if I had to be thrown in along with it.
What you're really trying to say, Jim, is that any girl who would marry you would be marrying just for the money. Isn't that it?
Well, wouldn't she? Wouldn't she? What other reason could a girl who... Oh, never mind. Please tell Claire Rogers that I'll not impose on her, and that if she'll send me my letter, we'll call it quits. Or does she know about the stipulation?
Yes, she knows. And wait a minute, Jim. You'd better think this over a little. Claire cared for your father without thought of return for herself.
Well, that sounds very pretty, but if you'd knocked around the world as much as I have, you'd know that those things just don't happen without a motive behind them.
Again, I say, you'll regret those words when you meet Claire.
Mr. Hunter, you may think you can tell by looking at me what my life has been, only you can't. I mean, there are certain things that I still have ideals about.
Jim, it was your father's last wish, expressed to me, that I would promise him not to let you bolt without meeting and talking with Claire. Now, you wouldn't refuse your father's last wish just to talk with her, would you, Jim?
No, I guess I couldn't do that.
Good. I'll take you, too.
No, thank you. If I must see her, I want to do it alone. Rogers, I've been here 2 hours, and we've talked about everything except what I came to talk to you about.
I'd like it much better if you'd call me Claire. You see, I've known you for such a long, long time, Jim, through your father, that... Well, please call me Claire. And let's not talk about anything that disturbs you this afternoon. I'm sure there are still other things that you want me to tell you about your father.
You've been very thoughtful to tell me all the things you have.
Oh, I'll remember lots more as time goes along. Do you mind if I ask you something?
No.
You went to the cemetery this morning, as soon as you found out about your father, didn't you?
Well, how did you know?
Because there were fresh flowers there. When I went on my weekly visit this afternoon after work.
You mean that you take flowers out to him every week?
He loves flowers, Jim. Somehow I believe you do, too, don't you?
Why,
I mean, I saw you looking at the sweet peas there on the desk. They're out of the garden. My landlady lets us roomers plant things in.
Look, all this talk, don't do it. I'm pretty well washed up, and I don't take this sympathy very well.
Oh, Jim, what a word to use between us.
Us? Well, that sounds as though you had already accepted the stipulation my father made for us to marry.
Well, I have.
Without ever having seen me? Why?
Well, Jim, maybe I can answer that better by saying that now that I have seen you, you're just as I thought you'd be from what your father told me of you. Just as fine, just as sensitive, and just as lost.
All right. If that's the way you want it, and the money means enough to you to take it, even if you have to have me thrown in with it, I guess you've earned it.
Oh, Jim.
I'll call you tomorrow and make arrangements for the wedding.
Wedding arrangements. Well, do you suppose Claire agreed to marry Jim because of his inheritance, Aunt Jenny?
Well, Danny, when a girl's had to work hard for years, money can make a big difference. But don't you go jumping to conclusions. You listen next time. Because right now, I want to appeal to all you wives and mothers. In times of anxiety, you are the one the whole family looks to for hope and strength.
That's right.
So even though it may be difficult, I'm appealing to you to be as strong and cheerful and matter-of-fact as possible.
True names are never used in Spry's real-life stories, Brought to you by SPRY, Spry, the improved all-vegetable shortening. Dan Seymour speaking.
Extra, extra. Lux helps you get extra wear from rayon stockings.
Yes, strain test proves stockings last twice as long with Lux Care. Get extra wear from every pair with Lux Care. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.